So we're going to look now at our final Vespers poem in the Wild Iris. In our book, it's on page 28. And the first line is, "Your voice is gone, now I hardly hear you." So we have seen kind of a shift in our speaker Gardner's attitude towards her audience, towards this god or this deity over the course of some of the Matins poems. We looked at a Vespers poem, and we've seen her go from like descriptive, we've seen her go to questioning. Now we start to see that critical side in the Vespers in Your Extended Absence, and we see that criticism there happening. So we're going to explore how the speaker kind of finally winds up or closes out her feelings towards this deity in our final Vespers poem. So again, we're looking at our final Vespers poem in the selection that we're studying. And again, as a reminder, as always, Vespers again, our evening prayers, and this is the final one in the selection. So this is the last direct address that we're going to get between our speaker, our poet Gardner, and again, our audience, which is our God slash lowercase god slash deity slash universal force, whatever you want to talk about, however you want to refer to it. So again, we start out with our direct address, right? We know that she is talking directly to this audience. And it's interesting because she is speaking, our speaker is speaking directly to that audience, but the audience is not speaking back, right? Your voice is gone now. I hardly hear you. So we're thinking here again about this idea of like silence and a lack of sound. And she says, "Your starry voice all shadow now." And that's such an interesting line because we are mixing this visual and auditory imagery, right? Your starry voice is like the stars and the shadows are that auditory imagery, or excuse me, are that visual imagery, and the voice is that idea of auditory imagery. So she's kind of mixing that. She says, "And the earth dark again with your great changes of heart." And so again, we have the contrast, right, with the visual and auditory imagery. And even within that visual imagery, we have that contrast between light and dark. And so we see, she says, "The earth is dark again with your great changes of heart," right? So whatever change of heart is happening in this god or deity, the earth has gone dark again. And so in the context of this whole kind of cycle of poems, what we're thinking about here is this idea of like the change of seasons, right? Especially if the earth has gone dark. So as we continue to look here, it says, especially since we're thinking about this idea of the earth going dark, and by day the grass going brown in places under the broad shadows of the maple tree. So that kind of reinforces this idea of seasons, right? Because we have the idea of like this, like the dying grass, it's going brown, that green, like there's a lack of new growth. And again, with that juxtaposition and that paradox in this final line, "Now everywhere I am talked to by silence," right? And so again, we're revisiting this idea about like your voice is gone. I am talked to by silence. So there is no response from, from our audience, from God. And so we, in our next stanza, which let's number these out. There are 4 lines here, 3 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines, 1 line, and then 2 lines, 2 lines. For the most part, it's interesting because the stanzas, the line numbers decrease, right? And so when we're thinking about this in terms of like what she is saying, basically, right? I can't hear you. I'm not getting any communication from you. Even the numbers decrease throughout this poem. I know that we have this one line right here, which we're going to talk about. It is an outlier, but generally speaking, we have a decrease in the number of lines in each stanza, which reinforces again that idea of silence or lack of communication. And so in this next stanza, she says, "So it is clear I have no access to you. I do not exist for you. you have drawn a line through my name. And so this idea of no access, I do not exist, and this idea that she has like quite literally been like crossed out. Now, this is, just as a reminder, this is all the speaker's perception. Because again, she's not hearing God's voice, she's not getting that communication. But because of that, she says, cool, I see how you are, right? I do not exist for you. And not just that, but you have actively, right, drawn a line through my name. Like you have actively erased me. You have actively kind of put an end to me. And she goes on to say, in what contempt do you hold us to believe only loss can impress your power on us, right? So what she's saying here is that this idea of loss, only loss can impress your power on us. So she says, in the audiences and God's kind of view, the only way to show power is through loss, right? And she says, clearly, that means that you think we're not super smart, right? Like you hold us in contempt. You don't think very much of us because you're showing us, like, oh, the only way to make these people kind of pay attention to me is to take things from them, right? Only loss can impress your power on us. And this line right here is describing that loss, right? The first rains of autumn shaking the white lilies. And so, again, that brings us back to our first stanza where she talks about the great changes of heart. This is showing that shift in seasons because we have the rains of autumn shaking the flowers. So we have that shift in season, which is a loss of summer, a loss of light, and in many ways, a loss of life. And so this is that description. And then we go to our final two stanzas. When you go absolutely, deducting visible life from all things, right? So this idea that our deity has left, we have that repetition, that parallel structure. And the speaker says, when you go, you deduct visible life from all things. And it's interesting because they make this, the speaker makes this distinction, right? Visible life. So, like life basically that you can see, that's what the deity removes. So, that's what's gone. But we have this final stanza. She says, but not all life, right? You take the life that we can all see. That's what the deity takes. But the deity doesn't take all life because then the speaker says, we know what would happen if you actually took all life. We would turn from you, right? So if that is this kind of like preservation of power. It's interesting because the speaker uses this word contempt, right? And what contempt do you hold us to believe only loss can impress your power on us? Like, how poorly do you think of us? And I would honestly describe the tone of this poem as, in many ways, that same contempt, but like turned back on the audience. She's like, cool, you hold us in contempt? Well, I feel contemptuous of you as well, right? And so we have all of this kind of contrast between like light and darkness, between the seasons, between like death and life, all of that. And it's interesting because she seems to be kind of railing against this like change in the seasons. And she seems to be blaming the deity for that. But at the same time, as a gardener, you would think that she would understand that this is just a part of life, right? And so we have the irony here that she is kind of like refusing to accept that change and is blaming the deity for this change and for this death. That she sees around her as the seasons start to shift. And so that is an interesting thing, right? It is a very like human thing to do to to blame God for death and loss, even though death and loss are a part of life and a part of the human existence and a part of this, like, kind of the cyclical nature of life. But the speaker is really struggling with that in this particular poem.